Ever notice how sometimes like sports talk goes way beyond just the scores?
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're all kind of buying into these narratives about players, and
Yeah.
are those narratives always fair? Are we getting like the full picture?
Right.
And that's what we're going to be diving into today.
Yeah.
We're really going to try to unpack this idea of media bias in football.
Okay.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at some claims that there's some persistent media bias against Dak Prescott,
Interesting.
how his performance is talked about, especially compared to other quarterbacks.
Okay.
And we're basing this deep dive on a really interesting episode of a podcast that I listened to called Uncensored Football Opinions.
Uncensored football opinions. Wow.
The title alone, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to have some strong opinions on this.
Yeah.
They really dig into how Dak's performance, is covered in the media, especially when they compare it to how other quarterbacks are talked about.
Okay.
And they get really specific.
Oh. Okay.
They break down Dak's performance in that Cowboys-Steelers game
Okay. Yeah.
a few weeks back.
Mm-hmm.
And they point out, look, they're not saying Dak played a flawless game
Right.
because there were definitely some interceptions in there.
All right. Of course.
But what they question is how much those interceptions overshadow everything else he did in that game.
Okay.
Leading that game-winning drive,
Yeah.
recovering that fumble. Heck, even his overall passing yards were pretty solid.
Mm.
It's almost like those mistakes, those interceptions, are the only thing that people remember when they're talking about that game.
Yeah, it's interesting how sometimes we get so focused on the one negative thing
Right.
rather than looking at the whole picture.
And they were saying that this is, kind of a pattern
Okay.
that we see over and over again. And it made me start to think about, like, how do we even analyze quarterback performance?
Right. Yeah.
Like, what makes a good quarterback? Is it just about, not throwing interceptions?
Right. Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I think it's easy to get caught up in the heat of a single game. Like you said, he had those interceptions, but he also had the game-winning drive.
Right.
And I think focusing only on a single game's worth of data can be really misleading.
Okay.
You've got to look at the bigger picture. You've got to look at the entire season. You've got to look at, their entire career even to get a sense of how good a quarterback really is.
Okay, so you're saying, like, we need to zoom out a little bit.
Yeah.
Look at the larger context.
Exactly. Because if there's already a perception of a player,
Okay.
say, the narrative around Dak is Dak can't handle the pressure. Even a good performance can get kind of twisted to fit that existing narrative.
Interesting. So you're saying that, like, there's already sort of a story
Mm-hmm.
that people are telling.
Yeah, and it's hard to break free from that.
Okay. So almost like a narrative bias.
Yeah. And this happens, not just in football. We see this in, all walks of life.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and speaking of narratives and comparisons, this is where it gets even more interesting with this podcast.
Okay.
Because they start comparing how the media talks about Dak versus, say, Jalen Hurts.
Okay.
Again, they're not saying that Jalen Hurts isn't a good quarterback.
Right.
But they bring up all these examples where it seemed like Hurts' errors are almost excused. Like they're just kind of brushed over.
Interesting.
While Dak makes what seems like a similar mistake, and it's like the world is ending. It's like, front page news.
Wow. Okay.
And they were giving some really specific examples. Like they talked about that game where Hurts threw that interception.
Yeah.
The one right to the defender. Like it seems like it was just,
just a gift.
handed it right to them.
Mm.
And the commentary afterwards was surprisingly tame.
Okay.
Like they weren't, calling for his head or anything. They weren't saying that it was the end of his career. It was just sort of like, oh, he made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
But then you imagine Doc making that same throw.
Right.
Oh my gosh. I think we can all picture the sports radio meltdown that would ensue.
Yeah.
Like, is there something to that?
Yeah.
Or are we just seeing what we want to see?
Well, I think you've hit on a crucial point there, which is this idea of confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, yeah.
It's something that we all do as human beings. We gravitate towards information that confirms what we already believe.
Right.
And this is true in our personal lives. It's true in our politics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely true in sports commentary, where it can run rampant.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily intentional.
Right.
But commentators, even the most seasoned ones, can fall into the trap of focusing on data, focusing on examples that support their pre-existing opinion of a player.
Okay. So they're looking for evidence to support what they already think.
In a way, yeah.
Interesting. Wow. Well, and when it comes to strong opinions in the world of sports commentary, This podcast definitely called out Stephen A. Smith.
Stephen A., yeah.
Stephen A. never wanted to shy away from a hot take.
Never, that's for sure.
Especially with the Cowboys.
Yeah. He's got his
favorites.
He's got his favorites and his not so favorites.
Right. But they gave all these examples, this podcast did, where he was incredibly tough on Dak for, honestly, some pretty minor things.
Okay.
Yet other quarterbacks, would make arguably bigger mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And crickets.
Yeah. Crickets. Yeah.
Like no big deal at all.
Interesting.
So that makes you wonder, and this is something that they were kind of alluding to. Like, is this really about analysis?
Right.
Or is this about entertainment?
Yeah. And I think that's something that, we always have to keep in mind as consumers of sports media is that there's always this tension between, providing insightful analysis and putting on a good show. And unfortunately, sometimes driving engagement, getting those clicks, getting people riled up overshadows the goal of objective reporting. It's much more entertaining to watch somebody yell and scream about how bad a player is than it is to watch somebody give a really measured, nuanced take on their performance.
That's so true.
It leaves you wondering, are we getting true objective analysis?
Right.
Or are we just getting a good show?
Are we just getting hyped up for no reason?
Yeah, exactly.
So, so we're sports fans. We're listening to this. We love football. We love listening to, sports commentary, whether it's on the radio or podcasts or TV.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do with this information? How do we navigate all this?
Well, it all comes down to critical consumption.
Okay.
You've got to be critical of everything that you hear and read. We've learned today that single-game analysis, especially for quarterbacks, can be really misleading, especially when it's, potentially influenced by a narrative bias, by confirmation bias. So don't just accept what commentators say at face value.
Right.
Watch the games yourself. Look at the stats yourself. Form your own opinions.
Be your own analyst.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Be your own analyst because everyone, even the experts, everyone is susceptible to bias.
That is such a good point, and it's so true. Like, we all come to everything with our own, set of experiences and baggage.
Your own narratives, right?
Our own narratives,
Yeah.
exactly. Wow, this has been really eye-opening, actually. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of seeing things in a new light now.
Yeah, and I think this conversation actually opens up an even bigger question, which is,
okay,
if this narrative bias is so pervasive, as we've kind of uncovered today, how does that impact a player's legacy? How does that impact how they're remembered, 10, 20 years down the line?
Wow.
Because we remember the stories that are told about athletes just as much as we remember their stats.
That is so true.
So that's something to think about. How much of what we believe about these athletes is actually true, and how much of it is just a story that we've been told over and over again?
Wow, that's a really good point. A really good point. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there for today.
Yeah.
But to our listeners, I mean, what do you guys think? Do you think that there is this media bias against Dak Prescott?
What other examples have you seen?
Right.
Not just with Dak Prescott, but with other players, with other teams, with other sports even.
This is a conversation that I think we all need to be having.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for listening today.
Thanks for having me.
It's been great having you, and we'll keep this conversation going.
Yes, please.
All right, everybody, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.